So the this study is about mythicism. So a particularly popular thing at the moment, the idea that Jesus didn't exist, but that the story was made up from other sources. And we're going to have a look at that and the problems with that view, and show that actually Jesus really did exist, and look at the arguments that support that. So let's start off thinking what the mythicists are saying. So the mythicist case is that the claim that Jesus did not exist. There was no person, maybe there was someone called Jesus, but nothing at all to do with the Jesus of the Gospels. And the idea that the Gospels and the accounts of Jesus were constructed from a set of different sources, mainly pagan sources, by taking copies of pagan gods, but adding to that some bits from the Old Testament, which makes Old Testament prophecy seem to be fulfilled. Now, I came across this via a movie called Zeitgeist, which has several different conspiracy theories in it, the first of which is this idea that Jesus never really existed. And well, the case I'm going to answer is put by Zeitgeist. There are a couple of characters who have picked up on that and are pushing it quite hard, and you find it all over the internet. So what do they say? First of all, the claim is that Jesus didn't exist because there's no independent evidence of Jesus. That simply you can't find Jesus outside the Bible. And the second thing that they claim is that the accounts of pagan gods, just like Jesus, so you can look at Asclepius or Osiris, or Horus, or Hercules, and they're just like the story of Jesus. And so Jesus must have been put on that framework with maybe stuff taken from other myths added to it, and with maybe a bit of Jewish stuff at all. Now, the problem with that is actually those claims are both totally untrue. There is evidence of Jesus outside the Bible, and the accounts of pagan gods are nothing at all like the accounts of Jesus. So, first part of it, what evidence would a mythicist accept? And the statement you quite often get is that the existence of Jesus is an extraordinary claim, and therefore it requires extraordinary evidence to establish it. Now, that's a fairly typical thing. Almost any atheist will make that claim. They do it because it means that they can then be particularly picky about the evidence. So evidence on their side, yeah, you can just take it without really thinking about it, but evidence the other side has to be absolutely 110% proven before they will even think about it. That's the point there. I'd say that the burden of proof goes the wrong way. You've got someone who founded a religion which has conquered the world, has made huge difference to the world. If there wasn't someone who started that, then, well, it's unlikely. And what you need is evidence to show that Jesus didn't exist. However, they then say, well, we can't take any evidence from a Christian. If there's someone who knew Jesus or who was with Jesus, then that will be biased, and so it should be ignored. And the other thing they say is that, well, if it's evidence from someone who didn't know Jesus, then that's hearsay and we should ignore it. Now, you might have noticed that there isn't any other evidence. All the evidence is either from someone who knew Jesus or from someone who didn't know Jesus. So what they're saying there is that, therefore, any evidence for the existence of Jesus should be ignored. And, well, it's saying that there's no possible evidence either way for Jesus. Therefore, we should reject it because there isn't extraordinary evidence. So let's think, how would you know that someone existed? And let's take a couple of examples. First one, Boudica, so known as Boadicea, or that wasn't what she was called in her life. And there's a nice computer-generated picture of her over there, rode a chariot, well known, and she was queen of the tribe of the Iceni, which led a revolt against the Romans in Britain. in 60 to 61 AD, killed thousands of Romans, derailed the attempt of the Roman Empire to conquer Britain, and they had to withdraw legions to come and fight her and defeat her. It set back their invasion by quite some time. That makes her quite an important person in history, but she hardly gets a mention. Just 3 writers mention Boudica. Tacitus, writing quite a bit later, he mentions her in 2 of his books. Tacitus, of course, is not an independent witness because he married the daughter of Agricola. So when he writes Agricola's biography, he mentions Boudica in that. But you could say, oh, he's not independent. He's part of the Agricola family. So you'd expect him to write whatever. He writes also a history, the Annals of Ancient Rome, and it appears in that as well. Suetonius gets a mention in the Lives of the Caesars, and then a lot later, Cassius Dio, writing about 200 AD, puts a summary of the revolt of Boudica, and it's the most detailed account that we have. He wrote it in his book about 200, but in fact, it's in a bit of the book that hasn't survived very well, and in fact we wouldn't know anything about it apart from some fragments were discovered somewhere in the Middle Ages after 1000 AD, and therefore we actually have this account of Boudica. They're fragments in a copy made by somebody in another book. So Boadicea, everyone's quite happy Boadicea existed, Boudica existed, but the evidence for Boudica is a lot less good than the evidence for Jesus. And Boudica is someone you'd expect to appear in the histories because she had considerable political significance. Both she defeated temporarily the armies of Rome, and she affected the careers of various Roman soldiers and senators during her revolt. Another example, Pontius Pilate, the person who had Jesus crucified was, of course, a Roman governor. It means that he had some standing in the Roman system, much more likely to mention than an obscure Galilean peasant. He's only mentioned by 3 writers outside the New Testament. He's mentioned by Josephus in both books, in the Wars of the Jews and in the Antiquities of the Jews. He's mentioned by Philo of Alexandria, who mentions him in his embassy to Gaius, went to visit Caligula to put the Jewish case to him, and mentions past governors of Judea there. And he gets a mention in Tacitus. Now, Josephus and Tacitus mention Jesus as well. He's also mentioned, of course, in the Gospels, in Christian sources, describe Pilate, but it's not a lot. Everyone was quite happy he existed, though. Those sources are sufficient. But the only one that isn't a Christian source that also talks about Jesus is Philo of Alexandria, and it's not much in the way of independent witnesses from that. However, in 1961, they discovered this stone in Caesarea. Actually, it's just a copy of it, but that's actually in Caesarea. And you can see there's the name of Pontius Pilate, second line on the monument. And we know that he existed from physical evidence. Also minted coins, but they don't have his name on. So the evidence for 2 people that no one doubts existed, and we've actually got physical evidence for one of them, is less than the evidence for Jesus. The evidence for Jesus, we'll look at that in another study. The evidence for Jesus is quite strong. So we've got non-Christian sources. We've got various historians. We've got 4 of them. Well, 3 are historians. One of them It's considered a historian, but it's really a set of letters. We've got people who were opposed to Christianity, who were satirizing it. We've got the letters of a chap called Mara Bar Serapion, who is difficult to classify. We've got some astronomers that talk about the darkness at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. We've got Jewish sources, and we've got Gnostic sources. So we've got quite a lot of evidence to support the idea that Jesus existed. And then on top of that, we've got a whole lot of Christian sources. Forget the letters, forget the Gospels, just the letters of Paul, James, Peter, and John. We have apostolic fathers, people who were not in the Bible, but who overlapped Bible characters. So people like Clement of Rome is writing before the end of the 1st century, probably about 96, and mentions Jesus, of course. We've got Ignatius just after the turn of the century. We've got Polycarp. We have people who are writing pseudo-Christian literature under assumed names. Another person writing under the name of Clement of Rome. We've got somebody writing under the name of Barnabas, writing a letter. Much more later on, but just taking early stuff. We've got various apocryphal Gospels, and we've got a fragment, Muratorian canon, which only got a bit of it, but it does mention Jesus. So we have a lot of sources. When you compare that with the sources for Boudica or for Pontius Pilate, there are way more sources that talk about Jesus. Far more references than anybody else, pretty much. One or two of the emperors get more mention, but only just. The other thing that the mythicists use is this idea of similarity. And I think this is where they come really badly unstuck. And they say, well, there's a huge similarity between Jesus and pagan gods. The myths of the pagan gods reappear attached to Jesus. So these stories have been pinched from pagan gods. You can see how similar they are. And they cite a fair number of them. I haven't got a complete list there. There'll probably be more. A lot of them are mystery religion gods, people like Mithras or Osiris or Tammuz. There's Zarathustra, Zoroaster, Zardasht, who is the prophet of a major religion, Zoroastrianism. And there's Romulus, who's the founder of Rome. But mostly these are mythical characters. And they say, well, the stories of those reappear in the story of Jesus. Better say that not all of those are count as gods. People like Romulus was a human being who was sort of exalted later on, same with Asclepius. Anyway, there's this claim that the details in these mythical stories appear in the Gospels and in general accounts of Jesus' life. And so there's the idea that the stories are taken from the ancient myth. Now, interesting thing is when you actually compare the gospel account with the ancient myths, then you find that the details in the gospel actually don't appear in the ancient myths. Actually, the ancient myths are quite different. Usually the people who push this haven't done a particularly detailed comparison. And the other thing is that the comparison is often very, very general. So they'll say, well, Jesus healed people and Asclepius healed people. So there you go. One is taken from the other. Now, in fact, Asclepius healed people because of his knowledge of herbs, and Jesus healed people by miracle. Totally different idea. The two aren't even vaguely similar. So you find that actually, if you look at the accounts, well, the comparison is such a general one. Another one with the Apostle Paul. They say the Apostle Paul's story is a copy of the Odyssey. Why? Well, Paul went on a journey at sea in which he was shipwrecked, but ended up landing safe on an island, and that happens to Odysseus. That would mean that in that case, you'd take every case where somebody got shipwrecked and washed up on an island as being completely mythical because Odysseus did it first. In reality, lots of people get shipwrecked and end up on islands. The details are quite different in the different cases. Take a look at an example. Mithras, often used as a comparison. And the claims are taken these from the Zeitgeist film. They claim Mithras, well, he must be just like Jesus. He's born from a virgin on the 25th of December. He's a traveling teacher who performed miracles. He had 12 disciples. He sacrificed himself for world peace. He was buried and raised 3 days later. And every Sunday, they had a ritual meal to celebrate Mithras. That's what they say. Not true, but it's what they say. And if you look at these claims one by one, you see that doesn't really work. On top of that, actually, there's no evidence to support Mithras very much. We don't know very much about Mithras. What we do know about Mithras doesn't come from written source. It's a mystery religion. Most of these were mystery religions. They didn't write down what they believed. So there isn't a written source for it. And what happens is that they look at inscriptions in Mithraea. There were special places where people did eat a meal to remember Mithras. It looks as though it's set out like a dining room. And there are occasionally inscriptions, and you can try and put something together of Mithras from that. There's a typical one. This appears in almost every Mithraeum where they can find an inscription. Often they've gone, but if there's one there, it'll look like that. And there you've got Mithras, who is and there's Mithras, who is killing a bull with a sword, and there's always a snake nearby and a scorpion. We've no idea why there's a snake or why there's a scorpion, because there's nothing written. And often there are two other gods looking down from heaven. It's not clear why, but there they are. The other thing we get is this. This is you can read it at the bottom there. Petram generatriem, generatricem. It's saying that he is created from a rock, and what's happened there is that he has emerged fully grown from a rock, and he's got a sword in one hand and a torch in the other. Again, and that's almost all we know about him, but that's something that's sort of slightly ignored. I'm not sure it's ignored or not, or just twisted. So if you go back to the claims, well, born of a virgin on 25th of December. What we've got is he emerged as an adult from a rock. No woman of any kind, virgin or otherwise, involved. Nothing to do with the 25th of December. That might be because some people seem to have identified him with the unconquered sun, which had its ceremony at the solstice. Of course, the solstice isn't the 25th of December, but nonetheless, somewhere around that time, the unconquered sun had a festival. But there's no virgin birth, and the 25th of December is made up. Traveling teacher, no idea. Could have, might have. A lot of people, if you wanted to teach, had to travel. But we don't know. All we've got is those inscriptions that show him being born from a rock and killing a bull. Perform miracles, no record of any miracle. 12 disciples, no record of any disciples at all. The two figures we saw were gods looking down from heaven. There are a couple of inscriptions that have 12 pictures of 12 people on, but they're the 12 signs of the zodiac. They're not marked as such. They're not disciples. No account of any death at all, let alone of a resurrection. Ritual meal, well, the Mithraea are laid out in the form of a sort of dining room, although it's a long one that would take more people than the standard triclinium. So it looks as though maybe they ate a ritual meal. Maybe they just lay down as though they were eating a meal. But Roman calendar didn't have a week. They had irregular Roman holidays. So having a meal every Sunday seems a little bit odd for a Roman religion. So basically, what they've done is taken the story of Jesus and then imprinted it on Mithras. It's a story of someone who doesn't really know Christianity. It's someone who's taken sort of 19th century Christian ideas and push them onto Mithras. In reality, there's not much similarity at all. Another example, Horus, just picking one at random. And again, the claims, born of a virgin, with a star at the east, visited by three kings. It's supposed to have walked on water. That one, I think, comes from an account that he walked by a river. It doesn't say walked on it, just by it. Supposedly had 12 disciples, supposedly crucified between two thieves, raised 3 days later, and baptized by someone called Anup, who was a baptizer. And again, one of the things that's interesting is to notice the similarity between these claims and the claims for Mithras. Again, you get this every time. The Born of a Virgin on 25th of December appears over and over again. Now, how similar have we really got? Well, first of all, Isis wasn't a virgin. She was the wife of Osiris. She had another child who was Anubis. Well, the 25th of December, who knows? The interesting thing, of course, is that Jesus wasn't born on the 25th of December. People often celebrate the birth of Jesus on the 25th of December, but if you do the calculations in the Bible, it looks as though Jesus was actually born somewhere in September or October, that kind of time of year, and not in the middle of the winter. So there's no date for the birth of Jesus in the Bible, and certainly it wasn't in the middle of the winter. There's no record of a star showing up to herald the birth of Horus. No evidence for any visit by three kings. In fact, again, in the Bible, Jesus wasn't visited by three kings. He was visited by some wise men, and people have chosen to decide there were three of them, but the Bible doesn't say there were three kings or even three wise men. It just says there were some wise men. No record of walking on water. Like I said, it walks by the side of a river, but not on it. No evidence for any number of disciples at all. No reference to crucifixion, to burial, or to resurrection anywhere in the literature. If you read Plutarch, you won't find anything like that. Or you could read Ovid. It just doesn't appear. And Anup the baptizer is completely unknown. No record I can find of anyone called Anup the baptizer at all. So most of it comes from, well, doesn't come from ancient sources. Comes, I suspect, from 19th century atheists. In fact, I'll track down who in a moment. The only myth you've got is the one invented by the mythicists. There's no idea, nothing that shows a myth of Jesus in that. It's a mythicist myth. They've mythicized the sources and invented other ones. Now, it's not usually the mythicists themselves. It comes from elsewhere. And this idea of a dying and rising God that we get. And these are gods who typically pass into the underworld in the winter and then reappear in the spring, and are associated with the growth of vegetation. The vegetation dies when the god disappears back into the underworld and then reappears when the god comes up. And this idea is a late 19th century idea, and it comes up from a group of scholars at Cambridge University, the most famous of whom is Sir James George Fraser, who wrote the big book on this, which is called The Golden Bough. I must admit, I've only ever read an abridged edition of it. First edition's in something like 1890, and that's in 2 volumes. And then 1900, he produces another edition, which the second edition is in 3 volumes. And then he carries on, and between something like 1908 and 1906 and 1915, he produces the magnum opus, the same name, The Golden Bough, in 12 volumes. That's the front page of the first volume of the 12-volume edition. And he and his little school of scholars decided that there was really one ancient religion which goes right back to ancient Sumeria, and this has a dying and rising God who explains vegetation, and that all the other mystery religions stem from that, including Christianity. They stem from each other as well. There's certainly a lot of syncretism around. They do borrow myths from one another, although not Christianity. That's very much based in reality, as it were, in a real world. And he really only looks at six religions, or six mystery religions. There they all are. Makes a lot of Osiris, but he includes others as well. And he claims these are all similar to one another, and that they stem from the earliest of these mystery religions. In fact, none of those has a resurrection anything like that of Jesus. It's this disappearing into the underworld for one reason or another and coming back for one reason or another, but it's not necessarily dying and rising. And some of them, well, the way they disappear into the underworld isn't quite the same as others. So Orpheus goes into the underworld to look for Eurydice, who is his wife and who's died. He can't get her back. He comes up again, but he goes back again to have another go, and every year he has another go, and that's when the vegetation dies. Osiris, though, was murdered by another god, by Set, and cut up into 8 pieces, and his wife, Isis, goes around Egypt, finds 7 of the 8 pieces and manufactures another one, and is able to reanimate the corpse to the point where she can then have a baby sired by Osiris. He's then collapses back into death and becomes the Lord of the underworld. Nothing like the resurrection of Jesus. So these myths are really don't fit the picture of Jesus at all. A lot of them had an apotheosis where they die, and then instead of living in the underworld like most people in the ancient world, they are taken up to live with the gods. It's called an apotheosis. But it's not a resurrection. It's not bodily. It's just their soul moves from the underworld to the abode of the gods, wherever that might be in that particular mythology. So was Jesus a dying and a rising God? Well, first thing, of course, is he wasn't any kind of God. His followers never call him God. He doesn't call himself God. So he's not a dying and rising God. He's not any kind of God. But he had a genuine resurrection. He was physically raised from the dead. There's a tomb, there's an empty tomb, which other people knew about. They couldn't produce the body. And he has every connection to the real world. If you look at the accounts of Jesus, when they talk about a landmark, that's a genuine landmark. You can find it archaeologically. You get undesigned coincidences and all the rest of it, which ties Jesus to a particular place and a particular time. You don't get anything like that for any of the mystery gods. They live in a sort of mythical world. And of course, the similarities with Jesus are still incredibly weak, just like we saw before. So, conclusion, there's the mythicist case. It's the claim there's no independent evidence of Jesus. Well, we've already seen that there's actually quite a lot of evidence, and in the other study, we'll take a big look at that. Stick a link up the top. And mythicists reject a lot of that evidence because the conditions they put on the evidence that they're willing to accept is such that you can't produce it. It would mean a logical contradiction to produce any kind of evidence, no matter how good the evidence is for the existence of Jesus. The mythicists can say, oh, well, one of our conditions isn't met. And the other one is that the idea of the accounts of pagan gods being just like Jesus, not true when you look at them. And the mythicist case is actually based on very special pleading. It's not based on a genuine kind of inquiry. Is it a conspiracy theory? Well, it does all the things that conspiracy theories do. You take some plausible sounding evidence, which often will vanish when you look at it very closely. And you say, that's the evidence we're going to look at, and any other evidence we're going to argue like stink to try and stop that from being accepted. And we're going to throw it out a priori. So therefore, we're going to say there's no evidence that overturns the myth that we have produced. And then I'm going to finish.